Hello, I'm Marion Fulker and I'm the CEO of Perth's leading think tank, the Committee for Perth. Welcome to Fact-Based Talks, an online series where you get to hear the latest research from our organisation. Fact-Based is a long-standing joint venture research program between the Committee for Perth and the University of Western Australia. We are the leaders in delivering tangible research that drives structural, cultural and behaviour change on issues that matter to the people of Greater Perth. To date, the partnership has produced more than 80 pieces of research, creating a knowledge base on issues that affect our region and its future. These include the economy, global competitiveness, transport and mobility, gender equality, and the region's demography and geography, to name but a few. Each of these is available on our website for download free of charge. This current series of fact-based talks is the opportunity to share incremental research on our Future of Work project, which aims to equip WA and its people for the changing world of work. I trust you find the information and analysis contained in this presentation stimulating and that it adds to your understanding of a complex issue that affects us all.
So just to kick off, the first case of COVID-19 was confirmed in Australia on the January 25th last year. And since that time of really incredible uncertainty, we've learned a lot about the virus and about pandemics. And I think it's fair to say that a year ago, no one could accurately predict the impacts of the pandemic on either public health or the economy. At that time, the only real consensus seemed to be that the pandemic would generate a global economic recession and that the recession would decrease economic and job growth and increase unemployment. Job losses were expected in all industries, but were predicted to be most severe in sectors heavily impacted by COVID-19 restrictions. Women were also predicted to be most heavily impacted by job losses due to the effects of the pandemic on female-dominated industries and jobs. Other predictions included the accelerated adoption of technologies. This was based on international observations that in the past, technology has been introduced in waves that are usually associated with economic downturns. It was also a reaction to the shift to technologies such as video conferencing, e-commerce, distance education and telehealth, which seemed to almost occur overnight in countries across the globe as lockdowns and restrictions were introduced. So now, a year on, we've examined available statistics to look at how the pandemic and these predictions have played out in Australia and particularly in WA. But before delving into the stats, I think it's worth noting that the pandemic has had different impacts in different places around the world and within Australia itself. So the effects of the pandemic in WA cannot be assumed to be consistent with those elsewhere. Moving on, it's evident in the first slide, which shows the cumulative number of COVID-19 cases in each Australian state, that WA has had fewer confirmed cases than most other major states of Australia, particularly Victoria and New South Wales. And as a result, over the course of the past year, impacts of the pandemic on many aspects of life have also been less significant. As illustrated in the next slide, the success of WA's response has been reflected in the precautions, or perhaps more accurately, the lack of precautions adopted by WA residents, which as of November 2020 were significantly fewer than those adopted by people in other states, particularly New South Wales and Victoria. Most commonly, people in WA reported washing their hands or using hand sanitizer regularly, keeping physical distance from other people and disinfecting surfaces. But use of other precautions like staying at home and wearing a face mask were less prevalent. Of course, since then, the southwest of WA has experienced another short lockdown and the use of some of these precautions will have risen. But the key point here is that for much of the year, people in WA have been able to live a near normal life compared to people in other major states. This is because the core response to managing the virus over the year has been border closures and quarantines, which have been effective in keeping the virus out of the state and out of the community, limiting the need for individuals to take precautions to suppress spread. Shifting to the next slide, jobs in WA have largely rebounded since the initial impact of the pandemic, which was felt between February and May 2020. And were significant, with the jobless rate peaking at 8.7% in WA, higher than the peak Australia-wide, which was 7.5%. Yet by March 2021, WA recorded an unemployment rate of 4.8%, lower than the pre-pandemic rate and the lowest rate of unemployment recorded in WA since 2013. The Australian unemployment rate at the same time was 5.6%, also lower than that recorded pre-pandemic. It's fair to say that this level of rebound was unexpected last year, and there's been some interesting commentary reflecting on the recovery, with factors like the inability for people to travel overseas and therefore heightened spending of recreation and travel dollars within Australia, as well as border closures, which are thought to have made a difference given that people and businesses are now more reliant on hiring local people. However, impacts on employment have not been the same in every state, and explanations for differences in job impacts are somewhat explained by examining change by sector, which is shown in the next slide. In Australia, the accommodation and food services sector has been the industry most heavily impacted over the past year. But in WA, the accommodation and food service sector was heavily impacted from March to May 2020, but recovered relatively quickly in the latter half of the year. Also significant in WA was the recovery of mining jobs, which were initially heavily impacted by COVID-19 restrictions in China and supply chain disruptions, but showed significant recovery in the third quarter of 2020. Healthcare and social assistance, which is a very large employment industry, also suffered job losses early in the pandemic, yet recovered quickly and ultimately grew by 20% from February 2020 to February 2021. By contrast, sectors already experiencing headwinds and job losses, including retail sales, information media and telecommunications, and rental, hiring and real estate, appear to have experienced an acceleration of this trend. In addition, sectors like education fared fairly well early in the pandemic, yet have experienced the biggest declines in employment in late 2020 and early 21. This makes it clear that not all industries are out of the woods yet, and some impacts are yet to come, particularly for sectors that are being heavily impacted by border closures. However, the overall theme for jobs in WA over the past year has been volatility, and we cannot be sure that this volatility won't continue, at least in the short term. Moving to the next slide, something that we're all aware of is that COVID has disrupted tourism. In particular, there was a 48% decline in international visitation and a $1.2 billion reduction in international visitor spend, combined with a 53% fall in interstate visitors in the year ending September 2020 compared to 2019. Declines in intrastate visitation was much more subdued, with falls of 9% in numbers and 11% in spend, as shown on the graph on this slide. The number of intrastate day trips taken in WA also fell by 17%. However, average spend per day trip increased, so total spend remained consistent with 2019. I suppose what will be interesting is to see how visitor numbers are impacted in 2020 and 2021. While we know there'll be significant declines in international and interstate visitors, this will obviously be offset to some degree by growth in intrastate tourism. And given that WA usually has a significant deficit in services exports due to travel and spending by West Australians on holidays overseas, it's clear that total visitor numbers and spend could actually increase if WA residents holiday at home. The next slide considers part-time work. Our research shows that in the past, periods of recession resulted in growth in people working part-time, and it was predicted early in the pandemic that this would be a consequence of any COVID-19 recession. Statistics do show that there has been a small increase in part-time employment in WA, but it's also very clear that part-time employment has been volatile on a month-to-month basis. Also, some sectors have experienced substantial increases in part-time jobs, while others exhibit pretty big falls. The statistics do indicate that in WA, these falls were slightly gendered, with men experiencing less growth in part-time jobs than women. Staying on the theme of demographics, in terms of impacts on specific demographics or parts of the workforce, the next slide shows employment by highest level of education attainment in WA over the past 2 years. It highlights that problems of unemployment and employment volatility have been most significant for people with very low education attainment, particularly people with a year 10, 11, 12 or lower level education. The next slide looks at another key factor influencing impact on workers, which is the size of the company that they work for. In WA, people working for small and medium-sized companies were most likely to lose their jobs at some point over the past year, compared to people who work for companies with more than 200 employees. This trend has been consistent Australia-wide. It might show that smaller businesses were more heavily impacted by COVID, but could also reflect that they were more nimble in their response. Shifting to the next slide, statistics also show that young people have been more likely to lose their job during the pandemic than middle-aged or older workers, and this is evident Australia-wide. Despite this, middle-aged and older workers have been more impacted by declines in wages than young workers. The next slide considers impacts on jobs by gender in WA. And contrary to much of the global media discourse during the pandemic, which highlighted the risk of COVID-19 generating a recession that disproportionately impacts female workers, statistics in WA mainly indicate the opposite trend. So while there was a significant and rapid growth in female unemployment from March to May 2020, female employment recovered faster than male employment, and as a result, men in WA have been more likely to lose their job in the period from March 2020 to January 2021 than women. Males employed part-time in WA have been particularly hard hit. A key reason for this appears to be the fact that WA has avoided the extended periods of restriction and lockdown that have impacted on female jobs elsewhere. Because of this, women in WA have also avoided some of the widely reported difficulties of working from home for extended periods, while also trying to homeschool children and keep households running. Also widely covered by the media during the pandemic has been the accelerated adoption of some technologies and the increase in people working from home, which is illustrated in the graphs on the next slide. Interestingly, research has validated this perception, but it also shows that the shift has been less significant in WA than in other states. In particular, it shows that West Australians have not embraced working from home, e-commerce or online services like telehealth in the same numbers as people from interstate. This appears to be due to a lack of necessity, combined with a continued preference among many West Australians to do business face-to-face. In the same vein, the next slide considers whether there has been a mass exodus of people out of cities and into the regions to make the most of the capacity to work remotely from home and get away from the negative impacts of COVID in the city. In WA, statistics show that this hasn't been the case, and there's net positive migration to Greater Perth from regional WA has remained. And in fact, COVID has increased Greater Perth's net gain of residents from within Australia. Statistics for Melbourne and Sydney appear to show a different picture with a net loss of residents from these cities. But when these trends are examined, it is evident that there's been a net loss of people moving out of these cities to the regions for a number of years now, and this trend therefore can't be entirely attributed to COVID. In regards to impacts on cities, there's been quite a lot of discourse in the media also regarding the impact of lockdowns, restrictions, and people working from home on the viability and vitality of city centres and on jobs in the suburbs. The next slide shows that in Greater Perth, COVID has had a spatial impact by influencing where people choose to shop and engage in recreation activities. In particular, there was a big decline in people shopping or visiting Perth city centre from March to August 2020. After that, activity began to recover but remained quite volatile. By contrast, there was growth in people shopping and engaging in recreation in outer local authorities, as shown on the map in green. The level and breadth of these impacts were significant, and it does raise some issues regarding the capacity for the city centre to recover, given that the city was facing headwinds pre-COVID. On the flip side, it has potentially increased the capacity for people to work at home and not travel to the city. And it's also apparent that impacts in central Perth have not been as significant as impacts in Melbourne or Sydney. Moving to the next slide, we can see a similar pattern in workplace mobility, with a particular decline in people travelling for work in inner areas compared to the outer suburbs, where movement fell, but the decline was less significant. This is reflective of workplace shutdowns across the region, but also the geography of work, with knowledge or office jobs most likely to be located in inner areas, and office workers also most likely to live in inner and middle areas of the region. These office workers were also the most likely people to work from home for extended periods of time over the past year. What is evident in the graph comparing workplace mobility in Perth to other capitals is that declines in workplace mobility in Perth have been less significant, particularly than in Sydney and Melbourne. However, it's noted that despite the smaller decline in workplace mobility in Perth, there has been a big fall in public transport use in the region. This shift of people away from public transport could have longer term implications as the transport habits of workers change. The next slide shows that residential mobility grew in inner areas, also indicating that working from home has been more of an inner and middle urban phenomenon than outer suburban, but also that residential mobility in Perth was less impacted than residential mobility in Melbourne and Sydney, which is consistent with the previous trends. So shifting to the next slide to provide a very quick recap on some of the key trends. In terms of impacts, volatility combined with relatively rapid recovery has been the key theme for jobs, and there is potential for volatility to continue in 2021. The biggest falls in jobs in WA have been in industries that were already facing headwinds, such as retail trade and the information media and telecommunications sector. While some previously propulsive sectors have suffered fewer job losses, growth in these sectors has been suppressed. This includes the accommodation and food industry, education and training, and tourism industries. It's also noted that these industries could face challenges in 2021 due to border closures and labour shortages. And finally, the biggest impacts on employment have been felt by workers with low levels of education attainment, by men, young people, and people working for small and medium-sized businesses. Some key risks for the future include public transport decline and the risk that it will be difficult to shift people back to public transport after the pandemic. Risks for the viability, vibrancy and sustainability in the city centre, which we know is important for vibrancy and long-term attractiveness and competitiveness of the region. There's a risk that some industries like tourism and education will be slow to recover when borders reopen. And there's a risk that WA will fall behind in technological change and innovation, due simply to the fact that the pandemic has not required the level of adaptation seen overseas. Moving to the final slide, this bulletin, as Marion said, is the final fact-based bulletin in the Future of Work project, and I'm currently working on the final report. It's progressing rapidly, and the next step will be socialising the draft findings and recommendations in May. This will be a really rewarding and important process, and we hope that you'll all get involved. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for listening to Fact-Based Talks. Our research is available on our website to download free of charge, and you will find this bulletin and other bulletins related to the future of work and all other areas that the Committee for Perth covers on Perth and its future available there.